Hello there, and welcome to my channel. So, I've always been interested in the election of 1912, and I've seen that some people have already made videos on what if Teddy Roosevelt had actually won that election. So, I decided to make my own. So, let's get started. So, what would have to change? Obviously, Teddy, if he wants to win, can't run as a third party. Running as a third party pretty much split the Republican vote and pretty much made way for the Democratic candidate to win. So if you look at the bottom right, you'll see a map of the United States, and some states are colored. Those states that are colored are states that actually had open primaries, which means that people were voting for their preferred nominee for the Republican ticket. The states colored in yellow / gold were states actually won by Teddy. And what's interesting is that Taft, who's in the color blue, had actually won Teddy Roosevelt's home state of New York, while Teddy had actually won Taft's home state of Ohio. I just find that interesting. But besides those states, all the other states pretty much had closed primaries where those states pretty much had conventions where they would choose delegates, and the nominees would pretty much jockey and fight for delegates in order to have enough delegates to clinch the nomination. So going into the convention, Teddy, because he won the most states, had an advantage, but Taft was able to win because he was able to jockey for enough delegates and clinch the nomination. The area where both Taft and Roosevelt had actually fought the most for in terms of delegates was actually the South. In the South, Teddy Roosevelt had actually for years been trying to get white Democratic voters in the South to side with him. But Taft was able to win because black Republicans were able to come in numbers and able to give him enough delegates to clinch victory. So Roosevelt would basically have to change some sort of strategy in order to reach more voters, especially black voters in the South. He could probably do this by appealing to more economic nationalism, progressivism, or whatever you want to call it. And by the end of the convention, tried to at least have more delegates than Taft. Alright, so after that, pretty much the only way I can really see Roosevelt clinching the nomination is coming with some compromise with the establishment. This could be by tamping down on some economic progressivism, so I don't know, not being as radical as he would have liked to be or whatever, as well as probably having a more establishment VP. So in case something happens to Teddy, at least the establishment gets some establishment guy in that position after Teddy possibly keels over. So what about the election? Pretty much, if we're going to be honest, if Teddy Roosevelt had become the nominee, it would probably not even be a contest. Woodrow Wilson, who I think was the governor of New Jersey, and before that, I think he was also the president of Princeton. I really don't see him having any chance against Teddy. I mean, I think he would have even lost to Taft as well. But I think Teddy would have a pretty comfortable win. And the map here is pretty much what would have happened had the Republican vote not been split. And as we can see, it's a pretty large landslide in favor of Roosevelt. So Roosevelt wins the election and gets a third term. So what does he do in his third term? He pretty much continues his uh, progressive policies, and when it comes to economics, I don't, as like I said, it probably wouldn't be as radical had he won with like a Bull Moose Party platform. It probably wouldn't be as progressive, but it will still pretty. It will still be pretty progressive. So some things we could see is probably improvements in healthcare, possible women's suffrage, although it's kind of hard to tell. It's bound to happen, but I don't know if it's going to happen this early or possibly a little bit later. Some another policy is he would also continue his military preparedness policy. Teddy Roosevelt had always been a person that thought America should always have a powerful navy and a strong standing army in case of emergencies. And I could also see him, like Wilson, we could also still see some intervention in the Caribbean and Central America. A lot of the interventions that happened under Wilson was also due to fear of a German influence in a lot of these Caribbean countries. So it's still very possible that Teddy Roosevelt could still intervene. And as we know, Teddy Roosevelt wasn't really afraid of intervening in Central America or the Caribbean. I mean, one good example is Panama. I mean, basically created an entire country just to build a canal there. So, what would he do when the Great War starts? Of course, he would begin emphasizing. He would put greater importance on military preparedness, seeing it as a way to protect America's interest, and as well as having a strong military, like I said, in case of an emergency or an attack. Teddy Roosevelt was also a strong supporter of the Allies. And in our timeline, when Wilson was president, he also criticized Wilson's weakness towards German submarine tactics. Although it's kind of unknown what he would actually have done, but it's possible he could have taken a much stronger stance against German U-boats. So, a little bit later, the sinking of the Lusitania happens, and this is where Teddy Roosevelt takes advantage of the tragedy and uses it to declare war on Germany. It's possible since there was already there were strong anti-German sentiments due to some of the atrocities that happened in, for example, Belgium. And there was some people in the Congress that, while not in the beginning in support of the war, they began to warm up to the idea of possibly going to war. And with the sinking of the Lusitania, it gives Roosevelt a pretty much golden opportunity to do that, since, like it says on the screen, it led to the deaths of 123 Americans. So America's entered the war. Of course, that means that war economy is begun, and as well as mobilization, which pretty much means that it's very likely that Teddy Roosevelt's domestic policy would probably be sidelined or slowed down, since he has to pretty much focus on the war in Europe. A change in this timeline is that Roosevelt's close friend, who had actually served with him in Cuba, he was actually, I think he was also part of the Rough Riders, General would be named Supreme Commander of American troops in Europe. In our timeline, Wood was considered as a candidate for Supreme Commander, but due to his links to Roosevelt and the Republicans, he was not chosen, and Wilson instead chose Pershing. But in this timeline, as a close friend of Roosevelt, and as well as having a Republican support, he would be named Supreme Commander. And like many of the European armies at the beginning of the Great War, I think American forces at the beginning would struggle with modern warfare, and I think it would take a little bit of time before American forces and commanders can become truly effective and help push back the Germans. So a little bit later, after entering the Great War, of course, Teddy Roosevelt would have to go through re-election. And with patriotism running high and likely still having a pretty having high popularity, he would likely steam over the Democratic candidate. And there would also be a feeling where he would need to quote unquote finish the job. So the situation of the war. American forces by late 1915 to early to mid 1916 would begin to arrive in larger numbers, as well with the passing of time also become more combat effective, and this would mean that the Allies with more forces and more experienced American soldiers would begin to slowly but surely push back the Germans. American aid and supplies would also arrive in these countries and stabilize their home fronts. So countries like Russia would really benefit from American food and aid, which would mean that the Russian monarchy could likely survive, although it's still possible that some sort of Republican revolution could still happen and somebody like a Kerensky could still come to power. But even if that would happen, I think with food and supplies arriving from the U.S., as well as the war in the West going in favor of the Allies, it could still mean that no communist revolution could still happen and Russia remains in the Great War. So the end of the war, of course, France would take back Alsace and Lorraine, and Russia, who had, I think before the war, had been planning on annexing Galicia from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, would, of course, annex Galicia, as well as parts of Eastern Germany. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would also break up, as well as the creation of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia would still happen, as well as Romania annexing Transylvania. With the U.S. having entered the war earlier and having much more influence, it's possible that some leniency to some countries like Hungary could possibly mean that Hungary and Germany could be spared some territory. So Hungary could possibly still keep some majority Hungarian areas in, for example, I don't know, southern Slovakia, and Germany would be left relatively intact. And in the Balkans, Greece would be given Bulgarian Thrace. So the end of the war in Ottoman Thrace and Anatolia. So Russia, I think in the beginning of the Great War, Russia was promised control of Constantinople and the Dardanelles. And I think Russia would likely gift Constantinople and the Dardanelles to Greece, so like a friendly country, or it's possible that Constantinople could be returned to Turkey, but under some sort of conditions, such as giving them access to the Mediterranean. Greece would be given Smyrna and pretty much all of Ottoman Thrace, an enlarged Russian Armenia. Although Armenia isn't given independence, Russia would annex the majority Armenian areas, so Erzurum, and it would also likely be given places like Trebizond. Southwestern Anatolia is given to Italy. I think Italy was promised southwestern Anatolia by the Allies if they joined them. And Cilicia and large amounts of southeast Anatolia would be given to France. So here's a map of what would happen. And pretty much the Ottomans would pretty much be relegated to northern Anatolia around the Ankara region. And the gray area would, so Constantinople and the Dardanelles would likely be given to Greece, but it's still possible it could be returned to Turkey, like I said, under some sort of conditions that Russia has access to the Mediterranean. In the Middle East, pretty much like in our timeline, the Arabs get the shaft. It's possible that some independent or semi-independent Kurdistan could happen, although with it being split among France and the British, it's probably not likely. So here's some version of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There would be some changes, such as Mosul being given to the British, and the map showing that Italy gets Smyrna. But besides those changes, it pretty much looks like what would happen in our timeline. So, end of the war in East Asia, it would still pretty much be the same in our timeline. In this timeline, Japan would be granted the port of Tsingtao, and would, with the support of the British and French, would be giving the German Pacific Islands, although likely at the protest of the U.S., even under like someone like Teddy Roosevelt, who actually admired the Japanese. The U.S. Navy was very against Japan being given this islands, since it pretty much isolated the Philippines. But like I said, with British and French support, Japan would still likely get these islands. So the area that's highlighted as the Japanese mandate is the area that Japan would be given. And as you can see, it pretty much cuts the U.S.'s access to the Philippines, although it's the U.S. in that area had Guam. But it's pretty much why the U.S. Navy was against giving these islands to Japan. So what about a League of Nations? In our timeline, Roosevelt, during the latter stages of the war, had actually called for a League of Peace. And the Republicans weren't actually opposed to some sort of league, but they disagreed with Wilson since they believed that a league would, the League of Nations laws would supersede national laws, and the Republicans didn't want that. But with Teddy Roosevelt, it's very possible that the U.S. could join a League of Nations, but a League of Nations that's weaker than the one that existed. And the one that existed was already pretty weak, so I don't know. It's pretty much up to debate whether this League of Nations would be worth joining. So the domestic situation of the war, of course, with the demobilization of forces and the end of the war economy, there would be a post-war recession. Although I think the U.S. economy would quickly recover. So with the end of the war in Europe and likely achieving the majority of what he wanted to achieve, I think Teddy Roosevelt in this time would likely announce that he would not run for a fifth term. But as we would see in the 1920 Republican primary, he would endorse his close friend and the Supreme Commander of American forces in Europe, Leonard Wood, for president. With the Republicans being in power since the 1890s, and possibly a lot of people wanting change, pretty much the only person the Republicans could hope to turn to that would likely win the election is pretty much Leonard Wood, who was basically a war hero. And in our timeline, Wood actually ran for the Republican primary and almost won, but an establishment candidate like Warren G. Harding was picked over him. So in this timeline, Wood is given a shot for the presidency, and Warren G. Harding is instead picked as his VP to balance the ticket. So in the election of 1920, with the support of Teddy Roosevelt as well as being a war hero, he would, by a decent margin, win the presidency, although with Republicans, like I said, having been in power for so long, some areas would likely turn to the Democrats for some sort of change. But, for example, in my opinion, had someone like Dwight D. Eisenhower in our timeline run as a Democrat, it's possible that he would have won, although not by the margin he had won, like in real life, running as a Republican. So, what would a president Wood mean for America? Like Teddy Roosevelt, Wood was a big proponent of military preparedness. which would pretty much mean a larger or possibly just better trained army during peacetime, as well as a strong navy. Wood was also a proponent of education reform and also advocated for better pay and conditions for farmers and urban workers. Wood was also in favor of immigration restrictions, like, for example, when he was the military governor of Cuba, he had actually banned Chinese immigration. In this timeline, of course, with no Russian Revolution, no October Revolution, there wouldn't be a Red Scare, although communism could possibly still be a big influence in some countries. In foreign policy, like in our timeline, with the League of Nations and tensions with Japan would possibly still happen due to a rejection of an equality clause, a racial equality clause in the League of Nations, as well as later on would possibly banning an immigration act that would possibly ban all immigration, such as in our timeline, the 1924 Immigration Act. As well as Wood, who, like Teddy Roosevelt, was an imperialist, would also try to increase American influence in the Pacific and East Asia, which would, of course, come into conflict with Japan. There would also likely not be any disarmament treaties like the Washington Naval Treaty, although with isolationism probably running high during this timeline, Wood would probably have to disguise his more militaristic policies under the guise of peace through strength. He would also try to get the Brits out of to quit the Anglo-Japanese alliance, although, like in this timeline, like in our timeline, the U.S. wouldn't enter any sort of alliance with the British. They just wanted the British to break the Anglo-Japanese alliance. So the Roaring 20s. In this timeline, pretty much by the late 1910s, pretty much near the end of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, the economy would pretty much begin to recover, and by the early 1920s, it would begin to boom. And with a progressive or moderately progressive president like Wood in power, this would likely prevent some of Wall Street's worse excess, likely delaying the depression possibly. And Wood would, of course, with a strong economy, enjoy high popularity in the country. And his re-election campaign would likely win re-election by a landslide. In his second term, of course, economic growth continues, continuation of moderate progressive policies. Although tensions with Japan could happen due to Japanese intervention in China, both Japan and the U.S., as well as the British, supported different warlords in China, which could cause some friction. Although I don't think war would happen because of this. Of course, in our timeline and this timeline as well, Wood had some health problems and actually had to go through surgery. So because of this, I think with his health beginning to decline by the second term, he would likely not run for a third term. And the situation in America and the world, by the time Wood's second term ends and he doesn't run for a third term, I think it's pretty obvious that the Democrats will likely take the presidency since the Republicans have been in power for so long. There could be possible tensions in the Philippines due to Wood having hesitancy to grant the Filipinos more self-governance and eventual independence. Although self-governance and independence will still happen, Wood, in our timeline, had actually been the governor general of the Philippines and was not very friendly with them. But I think most people in the United States pretty much wanted to grant the Philippines eventual independence. So even though Woods was kind of hesitant, it's pretty much bound to happen. War with Japan in this timeline, like in our timeline, is very likely. And with the U.S. having posturing more against Japan militarily and economically, it's only a matter of time before war happens in the Pacific. Tensions in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, could still happen. Although Germany in this timeline will likely not be as bitter, it will still probably be angry towards the loss of territory in the East. And with Russia, especially with the Western ethnicities in Russia, like the Polish and the Balkan ethnicities, getting a little bit rowdy, some sort of conflict still to happen in Germany could also take advantage of the conflicts or the tensions in Western Russia. Tensions in Anatolia, especially in the Middle East, could also flare off, but it's probably likely with tensions with the Italians and the Greeks. I'm not sure if Turkey would have enough strength to go up against the Russians, which in this timeline, their economy would be relatively strong, as well as communism not having as much relevance in this timeline. Although it's still present, and like I said, it will still be a relatively powerful force in politics in all sorts of countries. All right, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think of it. What do you think I got wrong? What do you think would actually have happened? So, yeah, please like and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed.